well, I think we should get started. Thank you so much for your patience and coming to join us to celebrate a very special occasion. My name is Kumi. I'm from the Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies minor program. Woo!
Hey.
His dream came true. The minor program as an academic program was created 5 years ago. So this is our 5th anniversary. However, he started the movement and all the activism back in the 80s. And he's going to share all the stories with you today. And also this year is the 20th anniversary of the Asian Pacific Islander American Heritage Celebration Month. So we are so happy to welcome Dr. Ling, and we have a wonderful colleague, John Duca. He's going to introduce you to you all. So thank you for joining us.
Hey,
John.
All right, I wrote a few things down to help me out here. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is John Jacinto Duca, and I'm with the university's Advancement Department. It's an honor to be part of this month's celebration of Asian and Pacific Islander heritage, and to introduce someone here who has helped shape the history of Asian American studies on this campus. So when you think of a pioneer in Asian American studies, you might not immediately picture someone who arrived on our campus when they were 24 years old with a fresh PhD in mathematics from Princeton. And our friend, Professor James Lin, certainly didn't think that either. Yet nearly 12 years after his arrival here on campus, in 1986, Professor Lin was teaching the campus's very first Asian American Studies class. And just a few years after that, he helped it to become a minor. So when he and I get together, he shares stories about this time period. Professor Lin often notes how unlikely his path was. He calls himself a math nerd. He called himself a math nerd at that time, who knew very little about his Asian American history and his background. But that humility is exactly why he was a perfect person for this job. In guiding others to discover their roots, he was learning about his own, proving that the best leaders and teachers are the ones who never stop discovering and who never stop sharing. So Professor Lin is here with us today to share his story and the history of his activism here on campus. So please join me in welcoming Professor James Lin.
Yeah. Wow. So great to see so many familiar faces. And for those of you who I haven't met, I'd love to spend some time later talking. I'm also going to go to the mixer tomorrow, so I'd love to socialize with all of you. But I've got a lot of stories to tell. I had to choose which stories I want to tell because there's so many crazy things that happen. My personal biography is stranger than fiction, as you're going to find out. So basically, I want to talk about how I started. I taught the very first course in Asian American Studies. And what is Asian American Studies? I mean, that's a good question. What the heck is it? So it's really the study of Asians living in the U.S., their migration. What's the story of their migration to the U.S.? What are their patterns? What is the culture, art, and music and history of Asian Americans? Okay, and then I need you to go back to the 80s. I know some of you weren't even born back then, right? 1980s. What was it like at UCSD? What did people believe about Asian American studies? Okay, so here's what the administration believed about Asian American studies. Their belief is that it is a political movement with little academic legitimacy, that it's going to fade away. The topic of Asian American studies is going to fade away. And I know that's hard for you students now, 2026, to believe that, but that's the way it was. And the administrator said, you don't want to hire anyone in Asian American studies. It's better to hire people who are studying Asians in Asia, because Asians in Asia, the history is much more sophisticated, languages, civilization, and so forth. So Asian American studies, they say in a couple years, it's going to be gone. Okay. So I come along, 1986, around that same time, I teach the very first course in Asian American studies. You're going to find out I taught it because it's about my life. My life is so crazy that I needed some outlet for this. And so I taught it because that was about my life. And it's remarkable how popular my course was. You're going to find out, oh my gosh, it's so popular. How did I reverse the entire opinion of the administration? How did I reverse Chancellor Atkinson's view? Well, I have a very strange upbringing. I was led to believe that the impossible is possible. Now, think about it. I mean, so many times we rule out certain things because oh, that's impossible. It's not worth trying. But at the age of 4, I was taught, so I had that mindset beginning when I'm 4 years old that the impossible is possible. Why? How? Well, because my dad built the very first modern airplane by a Chinese in China. And right offhand, I'm his first American-born uh, Chinese son. So he wants to explain to me what his life was like back in China. And one way to do it was talking about how he built this airplane. And so it was a way for him to practice his English. His English was really pretty bad at the time. But I'm 4 years old. I'm very forgiving, right? I have childlike wonder. So I was willing to listen to his story, and he practiced it. This story is ingrained in me. It's part of my DNA. I mean, he told it to me 100 times, at least 100 times. So I want to tell you that story too, just to get a sense of how my mindset was formed to believe that the impossible is possible. So the story goes something like this. My father, in a nationwide competition with all the other students in China, won a 3-year scholarship to go to the US, and he had a dream. He had a dream that I'm going to learn how to make an airplane and build one. So he won that scholarship. So the first thing he does is he goes to MIT and finds out all the theory of how to make an airplane. So he spends 2 years at MIT. If he spent another year, he'd get his master's degree. But after 2 years, he realizes he doesn't have the necessary things to build the airplane parts. He knows all the theory. He knows you have to have a wind tunnel. He knows all this stuff theory-wise. So he leaves MIT and goes to work in the airplane factories. Why? Because he wants to know how all airplane parts are built. And so he says to the airplane factory, I'll work for free. Oh, as long as I can go from station to station and see how each airplane part is built. And so then when he returns back to China, all the other scholarship winners had stayed at MIT, they got their masters, they played it safe. But he was the only one that knew how to make an airplane. And so he goes back to China and he finds out that the Japanese are bombing China. Actually, he knew this way before he returned back. The Japanese are bombing China. So therefore, you can't build the airplane in an airplane hangar because the Japanese will bomb it. So they looked all around the country for caves that were impervious to bombing. And so here's a picture of the airplane, and here's the cave. So you can see this, it's an incredible picture. I mean, it's just, to me, it's like, holy cow, he did this, he built the airplane in a cave. A cave doesn't have any electricity, it doesn't have any lighting, it doesn't have, he needed tools to build the airplane parts. So they had to figure out a way to build the airplane parts to generate electricity in the cave. And I tell you more details. I don't have time today to do it, but he did that all the while he's starving and he has malaria. There's tons of insects in that area. So he's starving, and then he tells the crew, you're going to have to build the wings and the fuselage. So he tells his crew to go out in the forest and cut down trees. And from those trees, he builds the fuselage and the wings. And then he also has to, he's just really in a tough spot. I mean, I would have, you and I, we'd never do that, right? We'd think that's impossible. But he did that. And so he convinced his crew, we're going to make this airplane. So they make this airplane, they cut down trees, they make the fuselage, they make the wings and so forth. And then along the way, and I'll show you another picture. Here's a picture of the plane without the crew, right? You can see how big the cave is. It's pretty elaborate. How much did they have to do to construct that cave to make it possible to build an airplane? And along the way, my mother is pregnant with my brother, Robert. And since they're bombing that area and it's unsanitary to have a baby in the cave, she decides, I'm going to take the train to my mother's place and have the baby there. So along the way, they're on that train and the train gets bombed. So my mother has to run out away from the train to avoid getting bombed. And imagine she's probably 8 months pregnant, carrying my sister Rita, and miraculously avoids getting shot by the Japanese airplanes. So, I can't imagine running when you're pregnant. I mean, let's think about that. You might have a miscarriage. All kinds of things could have happened. Okay, so the other problem is he can't convince the test pilot to fly the airplane, to test it, because this airplane, previous airplanes built by Chinese in China crashed and the test pilot died. And so his test pilot was very unwilling to do it. So he figures out a plan. He figures out that when the test pilot steps into the cockpit, he will also step into the cockpit together with my Uncle Tommy. And he tells the test pilot, yes, it's possible. This plane, just like all the others, may crash and we may all die. But if we all die, only one of your family will die, but two of the Lin family will die. And that's enough to convince the test pilot to try and test the airplane. And miraculously, the airplane takes off. I wouldn't be here talking to you today if that didn't happen. Okay, so then they build the airplane. My dad, my brother, and sister end up going to England to work for another airplane company. And in England, they have an officers club. And the officers club, it turns out they do all this gambling at the officers club. And my mother knows how to play poker, high-low poker. I don't even know how to play high-low poker. And I'm a mathematician. I don't even know the rules. But she plays high-low poker, and she makes so much money that she's able to take that money and buy this English Ford. So yeah, she must have had a lot of winnings to buy that English Ford. And then finally they decide it's too dangerous to go back to China after this. So they decide, let's try and go to the US. So she sells that English Ford and buys boat passage to go to the US. And so they take a boat to the US, and she's pregnant with me at the time. But they don't have any immigration papers. So, but then within days or weeks of their landing in Manhattan, I'm born. So I'm a birthright citizen. I'm an anchor baby. So just because by virtue of my birth, I'm able to naturalize my parents and my brother and sister to become citizens in the US. So imagine my dad's telling me this story over and over and over again. And in telling me this story, he's instilling certain values in me. He's instilling these values that, look, life is going to be risky. You have to take chances. Maybe you just have to fly by the seat of your pants. And so I learned that when I was 4 years old. That's what I learned how to be. It's not, people say things are impossible, but maybe they're not impossible. You have to really test the waters. And I think that was the kind of spirit I had when I decided maybe Asian American studies can become institutionalized. So that's where I come from, that belief. So all of you, think about all the times that you cross things out like they're impossible. You can't do them. Well, maybe your judgment isn't quite right. And until you actually succeed, then you suddenly showed the impossible is possible. Okay, and so my dad, he's telling me this story. And oh, here's a picture of my mom and my brother and sister. I'm told that's a passport picture. The only one left now is my sister. She told me that's the passport picture. And then here's a picture of my dad, and he's holding a picture of the airplane. And that picture of the airplane sits in my house right now. And then here's a picture of me, as best as I can tell, probably about 4 years old. And when I look at that picture, wow, Jimmy, look how much childlike wonder you have. You're ready to swallow up any information that someone gives you. And your father's telling you all this information about his life in China. And he gets more animated, as his English improves, he starts waving his hands. The plane's taking off, it's taking off. And just like, oh, I'll never forget that. I mean, he's been dead for a long time now, but I'll never forget that story. And then if you come to my living room at my house, my younger daughter is an artist. She's a landscape architect. So she made this story quilt of the airplane taking off. And then you can't see it, but in the lower left corner, there's caricatures of my dad and my mom. And there's these mahjong pieces, because my mom, just to symbolize what a wild gambler she was. So this is the story of my life, beginning at 4 years old. Okay, so I want to change to a different topic. And that's the topic of where do I belong? So the process of belonging. For much of my life, I carried a quiet question inside of me. Why did I feel so alone? Why did every decision seem like I was the first to make it, as though I were walking a path no one else had taken? I wanted so badly to belong, to be one of the guys. Yet I often found myself on the outside looking in. Only much later did I realize that history itself had placed me in uncharted territory. The Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed by President Roosevelt in 1942, but only after that, each year, only 105 Chinese could immigrate into the US. So think about that. I was born in 1949, only 7 years later. So roughly, there's only 700 Chinese who are allowed to immigrate into the US when I was born. And of those 700, what's the probability that they would have a baby like me? So if you do, I challenge you to do a little math. It's not that hard. It's very, very unlikely that someone like me exists today. Okay. So let's talk about my origin story. After we're in the US, my father moved to the Pacific Palisades. You couldn't buy a house in Pacific Palisades. The realtors wouldn't let Asians buy a house. So somehow my dad avoided that. That was an all-white neighborhood. Okay, so I go to this all-white elementary school, Marquez Elementary School. And I still remember going to the cafeteria, bringing this tray of food, and then, well, where should I sit, you know? And so I finally sit down, and the kids, you know, I don't think out of malice, but they say, you're not American. And then I go home to my parents' house, and they say, you're not Chinese either. So I'm stuck. This is a very powerful message that I got when I was like 6, 7. I don't know. Just I don't belong, you know. On top of that, my dad was a tiger dad. I don't know if you know, tiger is just very extremely demanding. Like, you better do what I say, or, you know. So at the age of 7, beginning in second grade, my dad said, you're going to study math for 4 hours a day. 4 hours a day, every single day. So if you calculate that, that's about 1,000 hours a year. So I did this from ages 7 to 15. So that's 8 years, about 8,000 hours of math that I studied. Was there a cost to that? You bet. You know, I didn't go to football games. I didn't go to basketball games. I didn't go to dances. I didn't go to proms. I missed out on adolescence, essentially. I remember sitting in my room and hearing the faint sounds of rock and roll or maybe football games. These were all things that passed me by. So when you don't have an adolescence, when you don't have that bonding that, you know, you don't have friends in high school, you don't have friends in middle school. If you look at the yearbook, there's one Asian in the group picture. So I can't wait to get out of there. You know, I can't, you know, and back then you could score a high score on the SAT scores, and so you didn't have to graduate. So at the age of 15, I didn't graduate. I went to UC Berkeley. And by Berkeley, I did at least another 2,000 hours of studying math. So by then I'd studied math for 10,000 hours. That's what Malcolm Gladwell says. If you study anything for 10,000 hours, you've mastered a subject. And so that's what happened. I'm a total nerd. I have no social skills because I haven't done anything in high school. I haven't asked a girl out to dance. I haven't done the normal things that people do. And so I enter high school without a high school diploma. And then I go to Princeton. I narrowly escaped the Vietnam War. William Westmoreland says, Asians have no compassion for human life. I remember that, you know, and nobody debated that. Nobody said anything against that. And, you know, what does that say about me? I have no compassion for human life. So that happened. And then I go to Princeton as a grad student because I escaped the draft. I got a high lottery number. That's how I avoided fighting in the Vietnam War. And then I solved a 25-year-old math problem that nobody can solve. And with doing that, I was probably the first Asian American born son of immigrants to get a job here at UCSD at the age of 24. And by age 30, I'm a full professor and I've won the Outstanding Teaching Award. So I did so many firsts, you know, I began to write down all the firsts that I did. So I was the first American-born son of Chinese immigrants in my neighborhood. I was the first to spend nearly a decade in enforced solitude studying math. I was the first to leave high school at 15 and enter Berkeley, and the first American-born Asian son of immigrants to earn a PhD in mathematics. And later, I was the first to stand at the front of a UCSD lecture hall as a UCSD professor. So each one of these firsts said no one would show me the way. I didn't have any other Asian showing me how to be. You know, I was just doing this all on my own. Now, when you study the history of Asian American studies, you just see these words appear over and over again. It's filled with words like perpetual foreigner, sojourner, exclusion, like the Chinese Exclusion Act, unassimilable, um, internment, like the Japanese internment, outsider, no compassion for human life. And when I first started here at UCSD, I'd be walking down the street and someone would lower their windows and say, go back to where you came from. Or people would ask, where are you really from? And then even my daughter, my youngest daughter, who paddle boards in Mission Bay, has heard people yell at her, go home. So you get so many messages of not belonging. Well, then I meet my mentor, Ling Chi Wang. He's teaching in the history department. He's a visitor from Berkeley. He's the one who started Asian American Studies at Berkeley. And he looks at me, I'm sitting in his history class about, he's an expert on Chinese Americans post-World War II. And he says, who are you? You know, you're not young like the other students, but you're not that old either. Who are you? He says, why don't you come over for dinner? So I go to his apartment. We have dinner. Linda makes this terrific meal. We're drinking glasses of wine. And I'm so engaged with him, I lose track of time. And before you know it, the kitchen window, there's sunlight coming in. We talked all night. I know it's inappropriate to do that. You're supposed to leave at a certain time. But that's what happened. So, but up until my conversation with Ling Chi, no one had ever explained how I was different. My parents, my brother and sister were so embedded in traditional Chinese culture and couldn't understand my American cultural values. Often I asked them, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? And they said, it's obvious. That's cultural. You know, it's Chinese immigrant cultural. It's not American cultural. So, but I grew up in an all-white elementary, middle, and high school, and it made me aspire to white values. You couldn't help but try to become white, except for I don't look white. So no matter how hard you try, you can't become white. Even though I was an American citizen, the American educational system completely omitted my history. I wasn't descended from the 13 colonies. I didn't remember Washington cutting down the cherry tree or whatever that stuff was. I had a completely different background. Given my life experience, there was no other way for me to adjust to American society than to adopt American cultural values. But my dad was really upset with that. Why can't you do this? Why can't you do that? Finally, we had a blowout. I explained to him, if he wanted me to adhere to Asian cultural values, why did he leave China? So like many children of immigrants, I had to deny and suppress these cultural conflicts like it was nothing. But after my dinner with Ling Chi, it dawned on me to consider the psychosocial impact of all that. Out of my own survival, I adopted the values of white America. But just to give you a sense of that, you know, I'm the first American-born Asian at UCSD to be a prof. And so what were my course and professor evaluations like? This guy speaks such great English. I've never experienced an Asian prof speaking English. I had this lazy California drawl, which I still have, right? Also, my dress, I wore Ocean Pacific surfing shirts. I wore cut-off jeans with patched up. I wore Huarache sandals from Tijuana. You know, I was just so different from what are the immigrants? They wore not to insult the immigrants, but they had these white shirts on, the slide rule on the belt, the black pants, and they invite me over to introduce me to some woman they wanted me to date or something like that. It just wasn't culturally okay. I was totally into, Carole King, James Taylor, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, all that stuff. They were into more traditional Chinese music. So no matter what I did, this wasn't going to work. So I stopped going to their parties. And I was young enough to really feel a common bond with the Asian Pacific Student Alliance. Most of those kids were 22, 23, and I had entered here when I was 24. So we kind of had the same concerns. Most of them felt like they didn't belong too. They'd come from Chula Vista or Bonita. They also wondered, how did I get admitted? And my other friend from high school was not admitted. This guy, Samoa Korea, he was the first Samoan student at UCSD. He said, "Oh, this other guy was so much smarter than me. How did I?" So there's this feeling of not belonging that we actually bonded around. So because I was one of the first American-born children of Asian immigrants, it was the beginning of a new cultural phenomenon. I wasn't Asian completely. I wasn't American. But what Ling Chi said, there's a new concept called Asian American. That was my new way of being, and I knew that was me. And so there's this African American social entrepreneur called Trabian Shorters. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he studied culture and he said culture is a transferable set of beliefs and behaviors that enables a group to survive. But see, traditional Asian immigrant culture didn't provide me with survival tactics in America. And so it was necessary for me to cultivate a new kind of Asian American culture where I could thrive. And so he says it's an understanding of how culture works well enough to use culture to change culture. And that's what I was doing. I was on the cusp, the very beginning of trying to invent a new culture called Asian American culture. And with that culture, I would change traditional immigrant culture and I would change traditional American culture. So that to me was the fit. That's where I belong. And maybe other people might feel that way too. Okay. How are we doing? Raise your hand if you're getting this. Am I landing here? Okay, great. Yeah, it's great you're nodding too. Okay. I'm going to take a breath because I've been so excited. Just be present here, okay? So how did I end up teaching Asian American studies? So here's the story here. There was this social service agency. It still exists today, the Union of Pan-Asian Communities. It's the largest social service agency in San Diego. And back then, there was this huge immigration of Vietnamese, probably refugees. And so the head of the Union of Pan-Asian Communities, Beverly Yip, wanted to talk to the chancellor about potentially teaching Asian American studies courses. So Beverly Yip brings a lot of prominent Asians, bankers, judges, lawyers, business to the special meeting. She sits on something called the Board of Overseers. I don't know what the Board of Overseers is to this day. But anyway, she makes an appointment to see Chancellor Atkinson. She says, look, all these Vietnamese are immigrating. This would be a terrific case study for some social scientists to study. How are the refugees adjusting to American society? Chancellor Atkinson knows about this. He knows what the agenda is. And he's somewhat arrogant. He says, well, I asked around, there's no professor that wants to teach Asian American studies here. So there's nothing I can do. And so the Asian community, I wasn't at the meeting, but they all tell me that he was kind of arrogant to them. And so he finally realizes he's been kind of arrogant. And so he says, look, I'm sorry. How about I give you 18,000, you can hire a visiting professor to teach Asian American studies. And if that is successful, then we'll reconsider. We'll look at it again a year later. If you have a large enrollment, if somehow you win over the academic community here, we'll reconsider. Okay, so they come up with Lawson Inada. He's the poet laureate of Oregon. She knows she's a literature major, so I know. Anyway, he's a poet. He's been interned in the camps. And so they offer him 18,000. He agrees to come. But then the dean is really kind of against this, one of the deans, and he lowers the offer to 14,000. Then Lawson Inada feels insulted. So here's Atkinson claiming no UCSD prof has stepped up to teach the course. And here UPAC, the Union of Pan-Asian Communities, really wants to get a foothold into UCSD, maybe eventually institutionalize Asian American studies. So these two dynamics are going on. I hear about this meeting, and in the most impulsive thing that I ever done in my life, I'm a full professor. So I tell him, Chancellor Atkinson, I'll teach this course. Give me the 14,000, I'll teach this course. What can he do? He said, no UCSD prof is willing to teach that course. I'm a full professor. I'm willing to teach the course. What can Beverly Yip do? She doesn't know me. I'm a complete unknown. I've never taken a course in Asian American studies. But back to the impossible is possible. I somehow in my gut, I believe the impossible is possible. No matter what, I'm just going to somehow do this. I'm going to somehow institutionalize it. So I take this 14,000 and I say, oh, what have I got myself into? This is crazy. You know, I'm a math professor. In fact, I failed freshman English at Berkeley. I had to take it over during the summer. I really, and here I am going to teach a course. I'm going to grade your term papers. So, and also, I've never taken a course in Asian American studies. You know that the people who teach Asian American studies, they're highly trained. They've had many, many courses. Okay. So, but the thing that got me angry is no one wants a job. If nobody takes a job, then the chances of Asian American studies becoming institutionalized would be dead. I mean, that would be it. And I think the administration wanted it. They wanted it to go away. Well, then I find out I can't teach it. You have to have a resume. You have to have credentials. When you come to UCSD, you have to look at my credential. I've taught Asian American studies here and here. You should give me the job. I have no credentials. So once again, I hit a roadblock. But I've got a really close friend, and that's Muir College Provost John Stewart. So here I go, my head between my legs. I say, look, I've got myself in this dilemma. I'm not qualified to teach the course. And then he mentions, well, he really likes me a lot. He thinks I'm, God or something. I've done so many things for him at Muir College. He says, well, we have this series that Muir College teaches. That's called the Contemporary Issues in whatever. And it allows a professor to teach outside his field. And I'm going to give you permission. You have official permission from the provost to teach this class. So I am really flying by the seat of my pants at this point. And not only are you going to teach it, I'm going to give you secretarial help. So you have a secretary. We'll put this on the schedule of classes at UCSD. So you're officially an official class under the Contemporary Issues series. And with that, we'll schedule the final exam. We'll have a secretary write up your syllabus. We'll have all the book lists. We'll have a reader put in the bookstore. All that stuff he does. And then I mentally measure, I'd say the math department, would not approve of this. What is he taking time off from his duties as a mathematician to teach? So I never tell them. And so I taught it in the afternoon, all my math duties, supervising PhD students, teaching 300 student lecture halls, all in the morning. So I had my own inside joke. For those of you who are old enough, you remember the TV show Secret Agent Man, right? Secret Agent Man, during the day, he has a normal job. In the evening, he goes off and saves the world, so all sorts of exciting adventures. So I was the secret Asian man. In the morning, I taught all my math classes. In the afternoon, I taught my Asian American Studies classes. And not only that, I figured I'm not qualified. I could just be reading, busting my ass every day, reading as much as I could about Asian American Studies, which I did anyway. But then to read it and then to walk into a lecture hall of 60 students and talk, it's hard enough for me to talk now, something I've already done. So I said, okay, I'm gonna have invited speakers. And so back then there weren't cell phones. You couldn't, I used phone cards back then. I got on the phone and here's my little speech. Hello, my name's Jim Lin. I'm a math professor. I'm trying to institutionalize a program in Asian American Studies at UCSD. You come highly recommended as someone, if you gave a lecture at UCSD about what you know, you'd go a long way toward furthering the institutionalization of Asian American Studies at UCSD. Would you agree to come? You can talk on a topic of your choice. But the proviso is I can't pay you anything. I can only pay for your airfare and your lodging and your meals. I don't have enough money. I figured, how am I going to stretch this 14,000 into getting speakers? And so that's what I did. And I got these amazing speakers. I think from their viewpoint, first of all, they must have wondered, what the hell is some math professor teaching Asian American Studies? I didn't reveal I have no credentials at all. I'd never even taken a course. I didn't tell them that, but they came highly recommended. I had a friend, Tommy Wu, who said, "Why don't you do the speaker series?" And so every week I had a speaker come in and talk about their personal topic about Asian American Studies. And if you remember back then, there wasn't, if UCSD had one speaker per year talk anything about Asian American Studies, that was a huge deal. Here I was, I had 10 speakers, one each week, and so they'd come from 4 to 5:30 in the evening and talk. And really interesting things. I'll tell you about who they were. Some of them were amazing. Like I was telling, I invited Elaine Kim. She wrote the very first book on Asian American literature. I invited Lawson Inada. He was a poet. I invited Lawrence Yip. He was a children's author. What did he talk about? He talked about his story that he wrote called Dragon Wings, where there was an adult male guy who worked in Chinatown, sent money back to China, and he had a son who he had never met because he would almost never go back to China because you couldn't go back and forth that easily. And his wife was in China. And so he talked about the isolation working in Chinatown in San Francisco and the visions and dreams he'd have of eventually meeting his son. It was very, so it was addressing the kind of isolation that Asians feel. Also, I had Ling-Chi Wang, my mentor. He talked about all the scientists and engineers and doctors who made medical breakthroughs in science, their contribution to the country. And then I had Lucy Chang. She was the chair of the Asian American Studies at UCLA. And at the time, UCSD won a huge grant to create the Pacific Rim School of Studies. Why did they win that grant? Because there was more trade now with Asia than there was with Europe. And so in competition with the other 9 UC campuses, they got the Pacific Rim School, which is now the GPS school. You guys, I don't even know, I forgot what GPS stands for, but it's essentially, global policy or something. And she argued, look, who's going to be facilitating this trade? It's going to be Asian Americans, right? Asian Americans already do import export. They already are familiar with the language. They're already a perfect infrastructure. Why don't you support Asian American studies? Because of the profound impact they're going to have on trade with Asia. So I had an all-star cast. I had Norman Mineta. He was maybe the first politician, Asian American politician. And later on, he became Secretary of Transportation for George Bush when 9/11 happened, and he ordered all the airplanes to go down. I had Peter Irons, who was a poli-sci prof here, and he discovered through the Library of Congress that the government knew in advance. They knew, if you've listened to the podcast Burn Order, he went to the Library of Congress, asked in the Freedom of Information Act. He knew that the government knew that there was no espionage done by Japanese Americans. So and then I had Min Yasui. I'll talk to him about him. He was my keynote speaker. So here, I'm doing this 3-ring circus, and then I needed people to pick them up at the airport. So I had a potluck dinner, and I called all the Asian community members. I said, hey, I'm going to need some of you to pick up these people at the airport, and then they're going to go out to dinner, and you have to wine and dine them, and then you have to take them back to the airport. And so I had this spreadsheet where, these people signed up for different speakers on different dates and so forth. So all this was going on. And so these community members would come 4 to 5:30 on Tuesday and Thursday. I mean, how often do you have community members come to a course at UCSD, pay for parking, and then go to this course? It was almost unheard of. And here my course was doing that. So, I just, I didn't know I'm learning along the way, what is Asian American Studies? And then what was my goal? My goal was I could ask these people, how did you navigate belonging? I've run into these walls of navigating belonging. How do you deal with it? So I figured if this thing is a total, complete flop, at least I would find out from 10 people how they navigated, how they belonged in American society. But, you just have to realize how much I was flying by the seat of my pants, Okay. All right, so here's a picture of Beverly Yip. She was the director of UPAC, and she later died from pancreatic cancer. Okay, the other thing that Muir College provided for me was they made this poster. So remember, back in the 80s, there's no internet, there's no email. I mean, if you want to see a course now in ethnic studies, I'm in the newsletter. They send me an announcement. We're teaching this course, we're teaching that course, et cetera, et cetera. No, there's no such thing back in the 80s. There's no email, there's no internet, there's no cell phones. Like I paid using phone cards to do that. So I needed to do some marketing. So Muir College made this poster, and it announces it's called Contemporary Issues in Asian American Studies. And in the front of the poster, there's a a report. You have to report to these different centers. It's part of the Japanese internment. And then, since my keynote speaker was going to talk about the internment, I took my cigarette lighter, I burned a hole in that poster, and I put his face in there. Okay, and then it says this course is a personal development course for Asians and non-Asians to discover and rediscover their ethnic heritage in the US and its treatment of Asians in America. And there'll be a speaker series. Okay, so I want to spend some time to tell you who Min Yasui was, how he impacted UCSD, how he impacted my program. And it's he was my role model. Even to this day, he's my role model of an Asian American man. So he was a Regent Scholar. So he was, he drew a huge audience. People knew about him. I didn't know about him, but people knew about him. So I scheduled for him to speak in Peterson Hall, the very largest lecture hall at UCSD. Had about 400 people could sit in there. So the audience was packed. And because I'd won this contest, so to be a Regent Scholar, you have to write an application in competition with the other 9 campuses. Like, oh, this person is a special person who will add a lot to UCSD. And so I said, this guy is a charismatic speaker. He's known around the country. He's going to make a difference in terms of a class I'm trying to institutionalize, so forth. And incredibly, I won. I won among all the competitions. I won it. And so it's very prestigious to win it. And so Chancellor Atkinson said, oh, you won this scholarship, So I'm sure at that point, he's beginning to think maybe Asian American Studies is not a political movement. He got bad advice from his deans. So he said, I'm going to attend because UCSD never gets Regent Scholars. So he's in the audience at 8 p.m. at night. The auditorium's packed. I introduce this guy. He's this little guy. He's about, so tall, very well dressed in a perfectly fitting suit, so forth. And says, well, the week before I talked to Atkinson, says, I'm not going to support Asian American Studies. It's not worthy of support. And I didn't have a reason to say no to his answer. So Min Yasui, he's the American-born son of immigrants, just like me. I'm an American-born son of immigrants. He's the first Asian to graduate from Oregon Law School. I'm the first Asian to get American-born to get a PhD in mathematics. He's very patriotic. He's proud to be all-American. But suddenly, Pearl Harbor is bombed. So there's this war hysteria breaks out. Min tries to enlist because he's very patriotic, but he's rejected because he's Japanese American. The Japanese Americans are suspected of being spies. And so Roosevelt calls on General John L. DeWitt to do an investigation. Are the Japanese Americans on the West Coast sending signals to Japan about when to bomb the West Coast? And you have to realize this is war hysteria. People are just terrified that they could be eliminated on the West Coast. And so John L. DeWitt, who's the commander, makes this public statement. A Jap is a Jap. You can't tell one from another. The only way to make it safe is to put all these 125,000 Japanese Americans in camps. Earl Warren, who's I think the governor of California, he concurs. He says the very fact that no Japanese Americans have sent signals to Japan is further evidence that it's going to happen soon. I mean, what kind? He's a lawyer. He can't argue that way. Min Yasui's a lawyer, and he knows it's illegal to put 125,000 Japanese or anybody in camps without a trial. That's happening today, right? Now, ICE is putting people in warehouses with no trial. So what's he talking about? In a land that prides itself on liberty and justice for all, how can you incarcerate 125,000 Japanese, anybody, without giving them a trial? Later on, after the war's over, not a single one of these people is ever convicted of espionage. So Min is so powerful. He's such a strong, even though he's a little guy, his vocal variety is incredible. The guy is so eloquent. He's so gentlemanly. He wins over. He explains how American he is. And yet here he is. He knows the law is illegal. And so he contested it. He took it to court. For contesting it, he served 9 months in solitary confinement, put in jail. So he talks about all this stuff. And he says, he pounds the table. How can you accuse me of being a spy? I mean, if you're so all-American, so patriotic, how can you possibly do that? So 400 people give him a standing ovation. They all claim this should be taught in the schools. The question of academic legitimacy claimed by the administration is just totally, in fact, this case is taught in every law school in the country, and yet it's not taught at UCSD. So the chancellor, a couple days later, he calls me and says, I'm changing my mind. I'm going to support Asian American studies. So he knows he made a mistake. The provost realized this is a blind spot in the students' education. So they fund Asian American studies for 3 more years. I mean, just to get that 14,000 was like pulling teeth. One of my students, for all this time there, I had to convince them to take my course. It's like twisting arms. But they look at the audience and they look at the enthusiasm for this piece of education. They realize, oh, so that's what this crazy mathematician was talking about, why Asian American studies is important. So the students, of their own accord, begin circulating petitions. There's only 1,500 Asian students on campus. 400 of them signed the petition demanding Asian American studies be institutionalized. 30 professors demand it be institutionalized. Within 6 months, Min dies. In fact, I'm taking him to these other lectures. I'm driving him. And along the way, he says, stop, I've got to smoke a cigarette. So he jumps out of the car, smokes a cigarette, and then begins to cough blood all over the street. It was that point that I realized he's dying. He actually had throat cancer. He knew even before he came to give this lecture, that he was dying. But he decided he could really make a contribution to Asian American studies at UCSD. So he never knew the impact of his lecture. But later on, President Obama would award him the Presidential Medal of Freedom posthumously. And then just last year, they wrote a letter to me. They want the videotape of his lecture in Peterson Hall. And he was so generous, I'm getting emotional here, so you just have to put up with it. He said it's really lucky to have a Jim Lin teach this course. So his talk galvanized the community, right? People were kind of walking around like, what's the point of Asian American studies? What's the point of this crazy mathematician doing this? What's the point? But then after that, the students were organized. They demanded this kind of course be institutionalized. People from the community wrote letters. Other faculty wrote letters. And so I want to mention my other mentor, Tommy Woon, who wrote a letter to the chancellor. He was one of the invited speakers too. So you get a sense from the student viewpoint, this letter. He says, my education acquired a new purpose when I enrolled in Asian American Studies classes in 1970. He was a Davis student. Prior to that event, my education was only a credentialing process. It was a sad mechanical activity to obtain a degree so that I could enter the job market, and think that's the way it is now, right? People are walking around sort of not really directed, and they're just waiting to get that diploma. But Asian American Studies provided me with a liberal arts education that stimulated my interest in every phase of learning. Because I discovered an Asian American literature, music, art, history, sociology, or an Asian American arts and sciences, so to speak, I could finally evaluate the full range of Eurocentric knowledge that had been imposed on me. Prior to my exposure to Asian American studies, my learning was devoid of any connection to my identity as an Asian American. That mirrors my search too. My education prior to Asian American studies did not encourage me to care about my country. The omission of Asian American content in my education was an unspoken message that I was not a part of this country. The denial of Asian American content is as detrimental as any Chinese Exclusion Act or wartime internment in reminding us that Asian Americans are second-class citizens in the United States. So that's what I was fighting for too. I want to have a place, a home. And by getting a permanent funding for Asian American Studies, UCSD now has a home where people can go to. They can also go to the Cross Cultural Center. But this was a big fight. It was a political fight to get recognition. We are not second-class citizens. So I want to move on. Then at that point, I began to think, well, is what I thought impossible? Is it possible? I put a dent in Chancellor Atkinson. He changed his mind. The 400 people applauded Min's lecture. We now have permanent funding for 3 more years. So let's shoot bigger. I mean, this is beyond my wildest dreams already, but let's ask for more. So I wanted to try to establish a minor. What is a minor? So just for the sake of this lecture, a minor gives us permanent funding. We don't have to go every year and appeal to the administration for funding if we get a minor. It's a lot of things, it's a menu of 6 courses, it's all those things. But for what we want to do, let's talk about the minor. So this was to institutionalize Asian American studies, because once you have permanent funding, it's never taken away. And so Kumi here, for example, she supervises the minor. Why? Because the minor was approved by the academic senate. So who's in the academic senate who decides? Well, there's 9 faculty. 9 faculty, 1 student. It's a committee that meets 3 hours once a month to discuss minors. So imagine, here I am, I'm on that committee. I put myself on the committee so I can argue for Asian American studies. And Ling Chi writes a proposal for me. He cites the things like the petitions, he cites the faculty petitions, he cites, the normal things. It's been successful for 3 years. Why shouldn't we have a minor, And then this anthropology professor, everybody else is in favor of the 9 faculty. I've somehow been able to convince them. I have a visiting person, Su Chen, who teaches Asian American history, and that's very successful. She comes into the committee, explains, what's an Asian American history course? What do they do? The anthropology professor objects with, you can guess it. He says, it's a political movement. It doesn't have any academic legitimacy. What is academic legitimacy? I don't know. I mean, all I know is my own personal life experience. That's why I thought it was important. I have to sort of perform some kind of academic judo or something to argue it has academic legitimacy. But around that time, the technology had improved in the libraries. They now had databases in the mid 80s. So it boiled down to let's do a literature search. Let's go to the library and get a list of all the research done in Asian American studies ever. And let's take a look at it. So the 3-hour meeting ends. I go to the library, summon a literature search, and then a month later we reconvene. And then it goes pretty quickly. It's one of those computer printouts, you know, those green and white striped computer printouts with the punch holes on them. 1.5-foot computer printout comes back. And then everybody looks at it, and the anthropology guy looks at it for a while, about a half hour. And he says, I'm really surprised. The amount of and quantity of research done in Asian American studies is comparable to the amount of research done in anthropology. And at that point, I just have an out-of-body moment. I don't remember the rest of the meeting, but that was like, holy cow, totally cut up the chancellor's argument, cut up the administration's argument. It's a legitimate field comparable to anthropology. And so after that, we decide, okay, now we can go hire people to teach in the minor. So, but here's the report of the committee. We do not see Asian American studies as a political issue. The program addresses genuine intellectual issues, establishes itself as a promising field of research in the social sciences, humanities, and the arts that one can take advantage of because of the cultural resources in California. We at UCSD are overdue in responding to the challenge. So we begin to look for faculty, and we find some really outstanding faculty. There's amazing people out there who would be happy to come to UCSD and teach in the minor. But the problem is there's a technical problem, and that's that all professors who are in the minor have to be housed in departments. And then we try and get the sociology department to hire this outstanding faculty person. But their history is they haven't hired anyone in the field of race for over 10 years. So I feel blocked. What am I going to do? I've spent 3 years of my life trying to get this thing off the ground. But then the departments can blockade this whole thing. So I'm just totally discouraged, and I resign as head of this program. And the deans are not very happy that I resign. But then this gets publicized in the San Diego Union. So in the San Diego Union says, in a major setback to a fledgling ethnic studies program, 3 UCSD professors have quit a committee set up to recruit faculty for the program. The faculty said the administration has hobbled the growth of ethnic studies because the program that studies minority groups is not welcome at UCSD. So when you publish some article in the Union, this becomes national news. This becomes a national embarrassment to UCSD. And so I'm out of the loop now. I resigned. I'm no longer involved with any of this again. So then there's an emergency meeting of the 30 faculty demand an emergency meeting with the chancellor. I didn't realize they've been watching everything I've been doing. Why? Because the African American Studies minor and the Chicano Studies minor, they had the same problem. They submitted candidates into social science departments. They're constantly blocked. So if you're in Chicano studies and somebody retires, you can't replace them because the departments won't house them. So Shirley Ann Williams, she's an African-American literature prof, and I never met her back then. Ken knows her. But she screams. She says, Chancellor Atkinson, what have you done? You've completely messed us up. And being Asian, I never talk like that to an elder, right? You don't do that. But then I was wondering, what's Atkinson going to do? And he meekly says, I apologize. We'll try and do better next time. So that's what happens. And then the head of the academic senate, Aaron Sickerell, also a sociologist, calls me and says, could we have a private meeting? And so we meet. Now, nobody knows about this meeting. And he says, well, I can think of a way out of this. Now that you have the Asian American Studies minor, and you have the Chicano Studies minor, and you have the African American Studies minor, you can now merge to become your own ethnic studies department. Once you have department status, you can choose your own faculty. You don't have to have the social sciences departments block you. And so that's what happens. A couple years later, Ramon Gutierrez, who's a history prof, writes up a proposal, submits it to the Committee on Educational Policy, and it gets approved in 1990. One of the very, if you look at the history of ethnic studies departments, not too many universities have them. It's a huge fight. But this one was approved in 1990, very early in the history of departments. And the very first hire is Yen Espiritu. She's a sociologist. And then later they get a PhD program. So Yen is one of the largest producers of PhDs in Asian American studies in the country. And those Asian American studies PhDs go on to other universities to do Asian American studies programs all around the country. Also, the Ethnic Studies Department produces a MacArthur Genius Fellow. So that's a real brand of how, academically legitimate ethnic studies is. It's Cecil Lytle's daughter, for those of you who know. So ethnic studies, this department is the very largest piece of infrastructure that addresses issues of race at UCSD. So think of, the George Floyd case, the Watts riots, all those things tended to not be addressed by social science departments. But having a department, an ethnic studies department, allows you to think in a scholarly way about issues of race. And then I was an acting provost. I helped create a diversity requirement. So every undergrad now takes a course in some kind of diversity related topic. So here's a timeline, because people in GROW, they have various ideas. So in 86, I taught the first course. In 88, I got the minor approved, so that meant permanent funding. In 1990, the Ethnic Studies Department was created. And then almost 25 years ago, after the minor was approved, there's something called the Coalition for Critical Asian American Studies, a student group. They demand that someone supervise the minor. Like, I got academic senate approval. Without academic senate approval, you don't have a minor, But now CCAS, in the catalog website, it says Asian American Studies was started by student activism. Well, I was back before people didn't even know what the field was. So how could you be active? You can't be active around something you don't even know. So Asian American Studies was really not started by student activism. I had to sit down in the old student center, drink soda bottles and eat potato chips and introduce the idea of Asian American Studies to the students. And then they had to twist their arms to take the course. So, and then now, Asian American Studies minor was staffed by Simeon Mann, and now it's staffed by Amanda Amaro. So that's a rough timeline. When you go back to 1985, there's no internet, no cell phones, no chat GPT. The Asian population in the country is only 5.5 million, of which 14,000 are UCSD students and only 1,500 were students of Asian descent. Asian American Studies was an unknown field. I had to twist arms to get them to take the course. But now, how's it different? Now, the US Asian population used to be 5.5 million. Now it's 22 million. So it's the fastest growing minority group in the US. What about the UCSD student population? It used to be only 14,000. Now it's 43,000. So it's one of the fastest growing universities in the US. What about the Asian student population? It's about 15,000. Used to be only 1,500. There's internet, cell phones, chat GPT, Facebook. I don't even know all these tech terms. There's an explosion of Asian American literature, music, movies, actors, newscasters. Back in the old days, the only role models we had were Bruce Lee and Toyota back in 85. Now think of, BTS, think of all these kinds of social media. Julie and I watch Korean rom-coms, stuff like that. And of course, Asian American Studies fulfills a breadth requirement. And I'd like to acknowledge one person, Daphne Dwan. She was a UCSD alumni. She called me about 3 years ago and was all excited. Jim, I have to talk to you. Jim, I have to talk to you. I found this archive of 400 pages of letters in support of my course. It turns out the chancellor holds on to all letters written to him, and these letters appeared there. And it's only it took me about 2 years to understand these letters. What was going on then? What was going on then? And so that's how I can give you the report of the Committee on Educational Policy on the minor and so forth. And then so many of the faculty and administrators, they're gone now. Either they died or they went to other universities. And so it's only because I got my degree really young when I was 24 that I've kind of outlived them. So my journey was to find out where I belong. And I found that out through Ben Yasui, through Ling-Chi Wang and Tommy Woon. And my classroom was such a laboratory. There was older people there were 22-year-olds there, and the 22-year-olds would ask the older community members, was it like that when you were my age? Did you do that? Did you face that conflict? So there's this kind of magical intergenerational conversation. And when I look back, it's been over 40 years. I wouldn't have been able to do it without believing that the impossible is possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was an incredible